of all.
Good evening, everyone. My name is David Jordan, and I have the honor of being one of the pastors here at First Baptist Church of Decatur. And we are so thankful for events like this, and we're very grateful for our partnership with Georgia Center for the Book. Joe Davich and Allie Wright have been tremendous partners with us over the years and have allowed us to host a number of events like this where we get to hear about what authors are thinking and what stimulated their imaginations to help stimulate our imaginations. And so we're so thankful to be able to have these events move through and in this sacred space of our sanctuary, and that you are here as a part of this evening. So thank you for your presence. Thank you for allowing us to host events like this, and thank you for sharing in this partnership with us and the Georgia Center for the Book. Welcome, and I hope you enjoy this evening.
Thank you so much, David. Of course, you can't do series like these without a whole lot of hands. And I first would, of course, like to acknowledge everyone here at First Baptist Church Decatur, from doing the sound and having greeters, and everyone over here that's volunteering. Thank you so much for all you do for this series. If you all haven't been with us or don't know, originally the Joshilyn Jackson series was going to be a stage at the Decatur Book Festival pre-pandemic. So when the pandemic hit, we kind of pivoted to virtual and did this virtually for 2 years. And now we're here doing hybrid events. So there's you here in the church, and they're being streamed out onto YouTube as well. But that is kind of how this series began. And it's been through the work of Joshilyn and her compatriot Nikki Salcedo, and then of course adding this year Ginger Eager and our host Carmen Tanner Slaughter tonight, to just really put together a fantastic series. Just so you can all put it in your calendar, for next week we will be back here at 7 o'clock for Louis Bayard and Piper Hewley being interviewed by Joshilyn Jackson. Louis is the author of Jackie and Me, and Piper is the author of By Her Own Design. These are both Jackie O themed novels. Louis is about Jackie O in Paris as a young woman, and Piper's is actually about the African-American seamstress who did Jackie's wedding gown. So very interesting stories. It will be a wonderful conversation. And we'll close out the series on June 30th with Nikki Salcedo talking to Sonali Dev about her novel, The Emma Project. So a few people, though, that we would like to thank on the book festival side, because we are once again going to have the book festival here the first weekend in October. So join us October 1st for the Decatur Book Festival with the help of Emory University, the City of Decatur, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, First Baptist Church Decatur, and of course DeKalb County Public Library and the DeKalb Library Foundation. I'd also like to thank Angela from Karis Books for selling our books this evening. And don't forget, if you purchase copies, we'll just be up on stage after the event is over, and Denny will be happy to sign those copies for you. So right now I would like to go ahead and introduce our guests this evening. Denny S. Bryce is the award-winning author of historical fiction novels including Wild Women and the Blues and In the Face of the Sun. A former professional dancer and public relations professional, she now is an adjunct professor in the MFA program at Drexel University. A book critic for NPR, and a freelance writer whose work has been published in USA Today, Harper's Bazaar, and Frolic Media. She is a member of the Historical Novel Society, the Women's Fiction Writers Association, and Tall Poppy Writers. Although she's originally from Chicago, we can happily now call her a Georgian because she does reside in the lovely city of Savannah and drove all the way in from Savannah in this heat for us today. So thank you, Denny S. Bryce, for making that drive on Interstate 16. Our interviewer this evening is Carmen Tanner Slaughter, who is a voracious reader and cinephile. She is a storyteller and has spoken at the Moth Atlanta Carapace, Stories on the Square, and the Peach State Storytelling Festival. She is a board member and executive officer for the Cherokee County Arts Center and a board member of the Broadleaf Writers Association. She also is a trustee of the Sequoia Regional Library System. So once again, if you find readers, you will always find them in a library somewhere. So please join me to welcome this evening Carmen Tanner Slaughter and Denny S. Bryce.
Thank you all for joining us tonight, and thank you for allowing me to fill in for Nikki tonight. This is very exciting. I was just telling Denny back in the green room that Facebook is wonderful because they always remind you of everything that you do. And it was exactly a year ago today that my copy of her first book, Why Women in the Blues, came in the mail. And so I had posted how excited I was about reading that book. And then last July, we had a chance to do a Zoom interview.
Yes.
And when we were discussing this new book, I had said, oh, I hope I get a chance to talk to you about it. It sounds wonderful and delightful, not knowing that things would pan out the way they do. But I'm very, very happy to be here with you tonight and to be here with all of you. And we're gonna chat a little bit. I even brought my very special James Lipton note cards because that has always been a dream of mine, is to sit at a table with the note cards. But I won't ask you the 5 questions at the end.
Oh, you can try.
And then we're gonna leave time, obviously, for all of your burning questions for all of you out there. So please don't be shy. This is your time to ask anything that you want. So let's just get started. Would you tell everyone about In the Face of the Sun and what was the impetus for this book?
Okay, I can do that. First, I'd like to just say thank you for inviting me. I love talking to readers and having the opportunity to talk about myself, because I love talking about myself and my books. So to get started, in terms of In the Face of the Sun, I will say that back in 2017, I was in LA at the LA Film Festival, and I was staying at a hotel in Culver City called the Culver Hotel. Culver Hotel was built in 1924. It is a magnificent hotel. It's used to be a few blocks away from MGM, the old MGM. So it had a lot of actors and all sorts of stuff happening in and out of that particular property. So I went upstairs in their second floor. They have some information on history of some of the other things that are happening in LA, you know, throughout history. So I read about the Hotel Somerville. I'd never heard of the Hotel Somerville. And as I was reading about it, I was like, oh my goodness, how come I've never heard of this? It was the first luxury hotel built for African Americans by African Americans, and it opened in 1928. Prior to that point in time, African Americans like Louis Armstrong or whoever was, you know, all of the big jazz folks, they could not stay at the luxury hotels in LA because African Americans weren't allowed to register at those properties. So I was like, wow, this is a very interesting thing that I don't know about. And I consider myself a classic Hollywood buff, history buff person, so I was surprised. And so I jumped in my rental and I said, let me see what the corner of 41st Street and Central Avenue looks like. So I went there. And sure enough, there it was, the building. It even had the plaque outside that said Hotel Somerville. And I was just taking photos, and this is before I even had a contract for anything. I did have an agent, which was a good thing. So I'm wandering around the property, and come to find out it was no longer a hotel. It was a senior living facility. And one of the older women came out of the hotel and said, what are you doing out here? And I was like, I'm taking pictures because I'm going to write a book. And she said, oh, okay, come on inside. So I was given a grand tour of the hotel, and I fell in love with it. It was just amazing. And she shared stories. I imagine she was in her 80s or something like that, and she was just fabulous. So it was that, along with my mother's 1968 Mustang that she owned, that she never let her children get into. It was not allowed. Stay away from my car, don't even touch it. So those two things were the initial inspiration for In the Face of the Sun.
So your first book, Wild Women in the Blues, also has the dual timeline, the same thing with In the Face of the Sun.
Yes.
And when it first came out and I read about it, I was like, this is totally Carmen bait. Then when you told me about this book, and I'm like, it's old Hollywood, it's black Hollywood, my favorite thing. I grew up watching, Imitation of Life, Cabin in the Sky, all those movies.
All those things.
So I was like, it's more Carmen bait. But what I think you do so lovely is dual timelines are kind of my favorite when there's like a historical aspect to it. So with this book, In the Face of the Sun, it's 1928 and 1968. Now, when you decided that you were going to write this book after you became fascinated with the hotel, how did you decide what time periods you were going to write about, and how much research did you have to start doing?
Yeah, research is a beast that I am not a historian. I will admit that freely. I am a history buff. So that requires that I spend a lot of time really studying the time period that I'm telling my story, whatever that time period might be. With In the Face of the Sun, 1968 it was almost a given that it had to be 68. First, I wanted to have my main character, a character by the name of Daisy Washington. She is the POV, or point of view character, in the 1928 storyline, and she's almost 20. She's about 20 years old. And I said, well, I want to have a 60-year-old woman who is feisty, a little bit, wild, and some other things going on with her in my other storyline. So that I was like, 1968, why not? It's a year in history, American history, that is unparalleled to a certain extent with all of the things that were going on. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the riots throughout the major urban centers throughout the country, the Vietnam War, the Tet Offensive kicked off in January of 1968. The Democratic Convention, which I didn't even touch upon, and there were so many other things that happened from January 1st all the way through the end of the year, so including the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. So I took a week and said, okay, we're going to do a road trip, because I love road trips, and from Chicago. I spent a lot of time in Chicago, and I have this love-to-hate relationship with the city, so I always put it in the book. It's like, yeah, they got to be in Chicago at some point in time. So the Route 66, the classic Route 66, which you can go through some historical spots if you like to ever drive that route. But back in the day, it was still an intricate part of travel, and it kicked off actually in the 40s. But nonetheless, so I wanted to do that road trip as well, and I wanted that car to symbolize in a safe place. When the three main characters are inside that car, their world is very different, and their interactions are very different from when they step out of that car and have to interact with the world as it existed during that time period. And I wanted that juxtapositioning to be a part of the story as well.
So one of the things that I find with your books, and I know that you were a dancer.
Back in the day.
Back in the day, but you take these stories that address some very serious, socio-political issues, but then you kind of dance your way through the story with this really compelling narrative that people don't feel like they're being hit over the head with a history book. It's not full of trauma. You are very honest about certain aspects that people of color faced during that time in both books, and that the effects of racism and how it carries over through generations. But you never feel anxious so much, other than just like, how are we going to find out the end of the mystery and who murdered whom. But it's not that feeling of dread that you get with a lot of historical fiction when Black people are at the center of the story.
It is, you're absolutely correct, and that's very deliberate on my part in all of my storytelling. I really focus initially and very much so on character. Who is this story about? And who is that character, and how do they transform from the beginning of the story to the end? I like to say that the heroes of my story are people whose day-to-day, they are heroic in their day-to-day lives. It is not necessarily going to be this huge, historical figure, except I'm almost going to take that back, because 2 of my next books are about historical figures. They're called historical biographical books. But in these stories right here, and 2 others that I have coming up, I'm really looking to create the world as it was and put the people who are the stars of the story, usually fictional characters, in the center, and their day-to-day life is what the story is about, or I should say, what they're facing, what issues, obstacles, what have you.
So, in both of your books, there are these amazing women who are at the center of the stories, and there are these, I really don't like the term feisty, but I'm gonna use it.
Yeah, they are.
But I would prefer to say that they are women who have their own agency. And they are very much in control of their decisions, their actions. They are like, I'm not gonna succumb to the rules and regulations of society. And I wondered if any of those women are sort of semi-autobiographical, or they're women in your life, in your family, that they're sort of modeled on.
I would say that most of the challenge of writing fiction, I've only written 2 books. Well, actually, I've written 3, but it's not done yet, and it's due tomorrow. But we'll talk about that. Let me tell you, I'm be very serious about that book. But the challenge with character is to create fresh characters that don't replicate themselves in every book that you write. However, there's a certain thing that I do know. I always write about family, the family and multi-generational impact of your grandmother to your niece, to your daughters, to your sons. I'm very interested in that dynamic. I have been told I have a fiery personality.
Perhaps.
And I also, there are some other things that we don't need to detail. I know there's a recording going on up there. So there is that, and feisty, stubborn, ambitious. Some of my characters are vain. Who knows? But yeah, I like to write about women who, actually Frankie was one of my favorite characters to write in The Face of the Sun, because she's not strong at first. She is very much someone who has been victimized by a number of different things, not only an abusive husband, but some other things in her life that have made her step back. And to write a character whose arc takes her to move forward, I really enjoyed. And plus, it's not real interesting to read about, folks who just sort of sit there and go, okay, you want me to do that? Okay, I'll do that. So we want to have someone that the reader can root for. And I enjoy crafting that kind of character.
And both of your novels have this hint of mystery. I don't know if you would like to read the first paragraph of In the Face of the Sun to whet everyone's appetite.
Well,
but
in case I stumble, we'll give it a shot.
But it very much sets the stage for where is she taking us? Where is this journey going to take us? So
I love a good mystery. And plus, when I first started writing, I was more so involved in romance. I was very much involved in the Romance Writers of America for a while, and actually learned quite a bit about writing in that world. And one of the things that I will always say about romance writers, they are some of the best writers out there, and the reason is, you know the ending. If you're reading a romance, you know it's going to have a happy ever after if it's really a romance. And to have a writer craft a story that is compelling to keep you reading, even though you know how it's going to end, that's a pretty good writer. So I'm always a fan of romance. My stories include what we might call romantic elements, but they're not romances. I like love stories, and a love story doesn't necessarily have a happy ending. Sometimes it's just satisfactory. Yeah. Or something like that. Okay, I'll read the first couple of paragraphs and I'll probably stumble. Okay, prologue. Tuesday, June 12, 1990, Los Angeles. The night Veronica Fontaine died, there was a blackbird in the sky with a red and yellow triangle on its breast. It squawked like a crow, no song in its throat, just a curse, a string of damnations blasting my eardrums. A blackbird interrupts the stillness of the sunset, slowly flapping its wings, flying across the blue and crimson sky. The lone bird seeks its flock, but their numbers have dwindled, and this once abundant bird no longer blankets the heavens. I sit in the peacock wicker chair in the sunroom of the house on Naomi Street Avenue. Wicker chair in the, did I skip? No. Sunroom of the house on Naomi Street, holding a small cedar chest in my lap. The katydid song and the high-pitched chirping of crickets fill my heart with memories as the savory sweetness of night-blooming jasmine soothes my lonely soul. Yeah, I messed up a little bit.
So, how do you pick that book up and read that paragraph and not want to read the rest of the book?
Except for the stumbling part.
It's okay.
It's okay.
So, I know that Hotel Somerville was sort of like the beginning of it.
Yeah.
And then you decided on the two timelines. Mm-hmm. Now, when you got to that point, did your characters come to you? I want to know which character came to you first.
Oh, Frankie.
Frankie came to you first.
Frankie was the first. In fact, if you have Wild Women in the Blues, in the back of Wild Women in the Blues is the first 3 chapters or chapters, maybe 2 chapters, I don't know, of a book called Blackbirds, which was the original title of In the Face of the Sun. So Frankie had always been in my mind. I wanted to start with Frankie, and that's just the first character. Daisy Washington materialized more so because I was really torn. There's an actress from the 20s named Nina Mae McKinney. Nina Mae McKinney is a phenomenal story in and of itself, but she was I mentioned it in the story, Yes, it was a movie called Hallelujah. King Vidor, who was one of the sensational directors of the classic Hollywood time period, was the first white Hollywood producer to finance and create Hallelujah, which was an all-black cast for Hollywood, different from Wild Women in the Blues, where I talked about Oscar Micheaux, who was a legendary African-American filmmaker. He started in silent films, and he always was independent. I think later in his career, he might have had an opportunity to do some other works, but primarily he was producing, directing, and financing all of his projects. So anyway, Nina Mae McKinney fascinated me, and I almost did a composite character of her, but then Daisy started to materialize. She just started to sort of take over that part of the book. So definitely the two women. Then the next character was Malcolm Barnes. Malcolm Barnes. For those of you, okay, I do this thing called a mood.
Don't want to spoil it.
I'm not going to spoil,
yes.
but I'm going to talk about a mood board. As a writer, I create a mood board. And on that mood board, I'm a visual person, so I need to see my characters. Some writers don't need to see them, and they don't, but I need to see them. So there's this photo of Denzel Washington from when he was probably 25, 30 years old. And he's a good-looking older man, but 25, 30 years old, okay? So he was Jackson. And I know, but you gotta think of his parts. Denzel is an actor. I was a theater and dance major. I was not a great actress. I was a dancer, and I sang. But he's he's always angry. If you watch him, underneath whatever character he's playing is an amazing amount of anger. So he was Jackson. Malcolm Barnes is the actor who played Jackson on Grey's Anatomy. Just another pretty face. Frankie I found this amazing photo of Felicia Rashad when she was like 25. She had the Jackie O flip and just the whole thing. And I was like, that's Frankie. And then I took Nina Mae McKinney photos of her when she was a young person, and that was Daisy. And then Nina Mae McKinney when she was in her 50s, and that became Daisy again. But who else did I cast? If I was making a movie, however, Angela Bassett would play Daisy in 1968. And Keke Palmer would play Daisy in 1928 and Frankie in 1968. Just to see, I need to be in Hollywood too. I've decided.
We will manifest that these books will be adapted, and then you can be a producer.
The crazy thing about books right now, because Hollywood is starved for original content. Writers are tired of coming up with things. You'll notice that if you go Netflix, Paramount Plus, all of these things are producing new content, and a lot of authors are getting great opportunities to have their novels turned into aired subject matter. I had 10 inquiries for Wild Women in the Blues. Now, this process can take forever, and sometimes it comes to nothing. So it's just part of the game that I had so far just one for for In the Face of the Sun. But that's okay. Eventually, something will happen.
Yes,
and
hope so.
I'll get to do my red carpet. Notice how I go from just getting a deal to a red carpet, okay?
You might as well go
You might
all
as
the
well
way.
or go home.
So, speaking of red carpets, that's a great segue into the Hotel Somerville.
Yes.
And talking about how it came to be, how it was owned, financed by Black people, and it was the only place that the Black actors and actresses could go.
Right.
And so sprinkled throughout the novel, we run into a few well-known names,
Yes.
one of whom is well, he was known as Step and Fetch It.
Yes.
But will you tell everybody a little bit about the history of him?
About Lincoln Perry. Step and Fetch It, for those who have not turned on their TV to watch a movie from the 1920s or the 1930s or 1940s even, was a comedic actor as far as he was concerned. But his acting of comedy was derogatory of the black man. He played a lazy, shuffling, et cetera, et cetera. I like to sort of throw this out there. Dave Chappelle, many years ago, said his comedy, always brilliant, and when he was just about to get this huge amount of money to go really gangbusters, he took a look at the audience and said, what are they really laughing at? Are they laughing because it's funny, or because they believe that this caricature that I've created is truthful in some way? So I think that Lincoln Perry, he was the first black actor who was a multimillionaire. He was the absolute first one. And he did what he did because he was making money, and he was making Hollywood pay attention to him. Now, I don't like anything he did. Personally, I don't. I just can't stand it. But at the same time, he was a man of his time, and he should be recognized as someone who did some things that were important. He opened some doors for folks in Hollywood. He was also flamboyant. And I like to tell the story that I found in the history, when I was doing the research, and I'm not sure if I put it in the book because I've forgotten. And, but when Rudolph Valentino was a huge silent movie star during the 20s and 30s. Some of you have never heard of Rudolph Valentino, but women in America killed themselves when he died. He was just so hot, so hot. But, don't kill yourself. There's going to be another hot one coming. I believe this.
Always.
Always.
Yes.
So when Rudolph died, Step and Fetch It, AKA Lincoln Perry, he said, you know what, that man has some really fine cashmere suits. I think I'll go buy the dead man's suits and wear them. And he did. And he did. He just went and bought all of his suits, and he was in the great. I just thought that was the most crazy thing. He was proud, Lincoln Perry.
Yeah.
He's like, I got my suits. So anyway, that's my Lincoln Perry story. Lincoln Perry was in the book. I love Charlotta Bass, who was the owner and editor of the California Eagle. You will find a consistency or some mention in my books of reporters and media and the black press through history. I was a journalism major and master's in journalism, but I didn't finish because I got a job. But prior to that, in college, I was a theater and dance major, and nonetheless, when I was dancing, I used to write press releases for our dance troupe. But my point being is that I don't know what I was talking about now. Sometimes you just stop. You just got to take a breath.
So, one thing that I know from our previous conversation, going back to the research and the black press, that the majority of those newspapers are defunct now, but during that time, they were just chock full of all kinds of information. You had the Chicago Defender and the New York Age, and it was like, I love going back and reading them because it'll just have like a paragraph of, Lena Horne was spotted at the Kit Kat Club wearing pearls, and it's just amazing. So my question for you is, because you do historical fiction, the research, like how do you keep yourself from going down these rabbit holes? Or do you save things for like future books?
Well, rabbit holes. I'm going to talk about this for a hot second. When it comes to research, you're sitting there, you know that you're dealing with one time period, and all of a sudden you're researching whether or not they had corks and champagne in 1862. And then you go and you're like, I wonder what the bottle was made out of. Where did they make the champagne? And you're spending like years doing this, and you don't need any of that. And the fact that I mentioned is because that's what I did yesterday. But I was like, and then my friend who writes historical fiction, Vanessa Riley, her book Island Queen, she fussed at me because I was like, did they have corks? And she's like, if you'd read my book, you'd know. And I was like, thanks for that. But yes, the rabbit hole is dangerous, but one of the things that I've learned, because I've only written 2 books, and I'm learning all the time, I do this thing called goalposts. That's my first step when I'm going through history. And I really identify the things I can't change. If you were born on this date, chances are I'm not going to move your birthday. If you died on this date, I'm not going to move your death date. If there's major events that are historically significant and well publicized and out there in the world, I can't mess with those things. I'm saying this now because I just remembered I moved something recently because I needed I needed a historical figure to be 10 years older. So I'll put that in my author's note. She's not a major character, but she was important enough that I needed her on the page a certain place. But yeah, you have to develop a system whereby you don't get lost in the weeds. Because especially as a contracted author, time is owned by someone else. And you have deadlines, you have things that have to get done by a certain date. This book, Wild Women in the Blues, took me 6 years to write. This book took me 2 years to write. My next book was due yesterday or a week ago or a month ago maybe, has taken me 8 months to write. My next book is going to take me 3 months to write. Now, I know that's what I say. But what I do is I research all the time. It's sort of like a pastime. So all my research is done. When I hand in a proposal and for a new book, that research is on the page, and I do something called a narrative synopsis. I do not follow the 800 words, do this, do that. No, I write a narrative, I write a story. And my proposals can be up to 20 pages long. Yeah, so it's just a different approach. With historical fiction, though, I have not had pushback from editors, and we've won contracts doing things that way. So I think that they appreciate seeing that you've done the research, and that because the first thing that an editor will do is, they have this book in front of them, they have this story idea in front of them, they're going to Wikipedia, they're going to the library, they're wanting to make certain that your story is substantive enough and based on the facts that you're saying it's based on, if it's really there. So, yeah, even though there's a rabbit hole, you just have to have a plan. I am what they call an outliner versus a pantser. There are people who sit down and sort of kind of know the direction they want to go with the story, and they start writing. I would lose my mind if I did that.
So, again, you're just going right into my questions that I was going to ask. So I know from our previous conversation that last year you were working on In the Face of the Sun, but then you were also working on your historical biographical fiction.
Yes. That's the one that's due tomorrow.
But please tell everyone a little bit about that, as well as the other. I know there's at least one more that you are working on, and then you have a collaboration coming.
Oh, yeah.
So if you would.
I've been blessed. Let me point out something. I've been blessed with several contracts, back to back to back to back. And the blessing, I'm a full-time writer now, except I teach and I do some other stuff. I write for NPR on occasion. But My next book is entitled The Other Princess. It is a biographical historical fiction. It is based on the life of Sarah Forbes Bonetta. Sarah Forbes Bonetta is an African girl who at the age of 8 was gifted, that's in quotes, to Queen Victoria because she was saved from the king of the Dahomey in West Africa. Her life story is what I'm working on. She had a fascinating life where she spent her background in Africa as a child, what happened to her family, what happens to her when she goes to England, the back and forth of the time. The story begins in 1843 and ends in 1901, I guess, because that's when Queen Victoria passed away. So that is, I've been to England and London and Windsor Castle, it so happens, quite a bit. I've not been to West Africa. And however, when I was doing before my mother passed away, we did the DNA testing. And so, of course, family line is right to West Africa and Nigerians. My son's roommate in college was Nigerian and is Nigerian, and they're real close, and we're like, hey, it's because we were there.
We're cousins.
We're cousins, something like that. So that was a lot of, it's a fascinating story. And I'm having a great time writing it, and I can't wait to give it to my new editor. Now, after that, I'm working on a book called The Trial of Mrs. Rhinelander, and that's a story about Alice Rhinelander and Kip Rhinelander, which was a sensational story in the 1920s in New York. And it's the story of a young couple, who married, and Kip was a real estate heir. You know, he was going to get big bucks from his dad because they were Fifth Avenue, white folks with big money. And he married a woman who he wanted an annulment from because he accused her of not telling him she was black. And so from there, their story gets very interesting. And so I am doing a not a timeline, but just 2 POV characters. And I created a fictional character by the name of Marvel Cunningham, who was actually inspired by the real Marvel Cook, who was the first African-American reporter with the New York Amsterdam News. So I'm able to fold in all this sort of stuff, so that's fun. And then my collaboration, my friend Eliza Knight, who also has written a book that is doing fabulous right now called The Mayfair Bookshop. You should go out and get it. It is wonderful. She and I have started working on this book in 2019. It's called They Were Friends, a novel of Ella and Marilyn. It is the story of the friendship of Ella Fitzgerald and Marilyn Monroe. So we're very excited about that. We'll be doing that for William Morrow. It doesn't come out until 2024. But I'll tell you again. I'll remind people.
So, yes, you are prolific. It's what I was getting to.
Well, it's like when you commit to career number 5, you just go for it. And you just might as well. What are you going to do?
So we want to give everyone here an opportunity to ask your questions. I have plenty more if nobody feels brave and wants to get up, but surely if you're here, someone has a question. There's a mic right here.
You can shout too.
Yeah, I mean, we can hear you.
Yes.
I got one. When you finish the books, do you ever think there is a detail or event or situation I included in that
to keep sane, I don't look at the book ever again. No. I take it a step further. I won't even listen to the audio tape, and I know for a fact the audio tape of this book and that book are phenomenal. Everybody has told me, I mean, they're doing great. I have to keep moving forward, because if I go back, it'll. I think I know I get wackadoo. I just would. So I don't go back. I know I won't even let it cross my mind, because you can spend. That's another rabbit hole. That second guessing what happened. You know, you just can't help it. Oh.
That was going to be that was my thought. And if you did, how did you process that? I'm sorry, I thought I was talking loud, but that would have been the next thing, that if that ever happened, how did you handle it? So it's good to know that you just don't go back.
I just don't go back. Now,
Good.
other folks can do that, but for me, I have to keep pushing forward, because my personality, I sort of float towards perfection. Mm-hmm. And then what happens when you have that in you, you can spend potentially a year on the first 5 chapters of a book. And that, when you're under contract, doesn't work anymore. It just doesn't work. Now, when I was not under contract, I did a lot of contests, and I can write a killer 50 pages. But then you get stuck in writing a killer 50 pages. You go to 51 and you're like, don't read it. Just stop yourself right now. And so, there are a lot of, I've learned a lot from a lot of fabulous writers and authors that I got to hang around with and that I know today. And just some amazing advice that I get from people that has really helped me and continues to help me a lot.
I was curious, because I was thinking that, well, a great writer probably would not look back. One is a finished product. It's a finished product.
Well, it belongs to the readers at that point in time.
Right.
And I've learned so much from readers and doing these events, because I don't know why I never thought of that part of it, because as a young writer, I'm like, oh, I finished a book, I sold a book, I'm gonna talk about a book, because I did all the promotion for Wild Women in the Blues virtually, because it was in the heart of a pandemic. So this is my first opportunity to get out there and talk to people in person, and I'm loving it, because it's so much fun.
All right. I'm very impressed.
If you are shy and don't want to come up here, I will bring you the microphone.
I'm not shy. Hello, thank you for being here. My name is Tara. Please tell your friend that I read The Island Queen. I do not remember whether the champagne bottles were full.
See, I'm gonna tell her too, because
Tell her.
she lives here in Georgia, and I just left her house, so I will remind
Call
you.
her on the way home. My question is, so your surprise in discovering the hotel is what one of the inspirations for the book. What else did you discover in research once you started writing that was a big surprise? Because certainly there's a lot that we don't know about that era, because much of it either hasn't been shared or has been hidden away.
A couple of things. In the even though I didn't do anything with the 1974 storyline, I did not realize that women could not get a credit card without their husband until 1974. That freaked me out, frankly. But it sort of cemented something about my mother, bless her soul. My mother's name is Daisy. My Daisy in the book is not about my mother. I had to explain that over and over again to my relatives, because she'd come and get me. But that surprised me. In 1928, LA surprised me. Very different structure from Chicago or Detroit or New York. You have people with homes, African American communities with homes, housing. Now, there was still redlining. Redlining means that there were restrictions on where you could live as an African American or a person of color, because it was also Mexicans, Filipinos. The list went on and on. But just a different lifestyle. There was University of Southern California had many African Americans graduating from college. I mean, that was the Somervilles, were doctors of dentistry, husband and wife, and they were very successful. They helped start the NAACP chapter in California. It's just a different lifestyle, because my background is Chicago, New York, cities. I live in Savannah now, but I love cities. I love living on like the 20th floor of a place, but I can't do that now. But so that difference in historical, because the migration, the Great Migration from the South up north happened after World War I, more so. The migration out west was in the 40s. So it was a real different, scale. What else that surprised me? Well, I won't go into details, but some of the news stories in the LA Times, just the language used in reference to African Americans was shocking. That it was so, and desensitized, because it was like so common, King Vidor, one of his sentences was, it was so fabulous working with the darkies that, and they can really sing. I was like, okay, this is in the LA Times during the 1920s. So it was just those are big things, but that cultural environment, society at that time, was different expectations, and the people who lived in that time, their reaction response was different too. Not everyone was railing against the machine at all. It was living, that's what I try to stick with, is living the day to day. In 1928 also, I got to mention, I think it's in the book, about Scott Joplin, because I wanted to differentiate between the jazz scene, which was not always welcomed in the African American households that were back in that time. It's sort of like what happened with rock and roll and Elvis Presley. It's like, oh no, that's the devil's music. And that was pretty much what they were, remember Elvis. But, that was pretty much what was going on in the 20s when it came to the jazz scene. Another person that I sort of picked for a character named Isaiah was Robert Johnson. Robert Johnson was a guitarist who in the 1930s, I think, mysteriously died accordingly.
Sold his soul to the devil.
Yeah, but he supposedly, he was the Crossroads guy who sold his soul to the devil. But in 1960s, a master of his recording from the 30s was discovered. An amazing number of guitarists were incredibly inspired by him, including Eric Clapton, Jimi Hendrix, whole bunch of people who would just, and if you listen to it, and because I love music, I absolutely love music. If you listen to that recording, it is amazing because it has a lot of the licks that you heard in later guitar, people who played, the Les Paul or Fender Stratocaster or something like that. Not that I've ever been a guitarist, but I love music. All kinds of music, everything. So that was a long answer too.
So we have time for one more question, and then we will give you the opportunity to go out and purchase her books. And thanks to Karis, they will be out front selling both copies, and you're going to sign.
Yes.
So we'll have one more question.
What's on your nightstand?
What's on my nightstand? Okay, I am reading Sister Mother Warrior by Vanessa Riley. That's an ARC. An ARC is an early copy of a book, and her book comes out next month. I just started reading that. I just finished, or I'm just starting. I read a lot of I don't have a lot of time to read because I'm on that deadline that I keep mentioning. Chanel Cleeton, I love Chanel Cleeton. She writes historical fiction. She was a romance writer for years. Her stories are so compelling. She focuses her series as, she's Cuban American, and her stories are fabulous. One of my favorites is The Last Train to Key West. Right now, her new book is Our Last Days in Barcelona. It's fabulous. I am a huge fan of Beatrice Williams, and this is where my love for the dual timeline. Beatrice Williams and Kate Quinn, if you have not read The Alice Network, OMG. Then go to Summer Wives by Beatrice Williams.
And 100 Summers. That is the book that made me fall in love with historical fiction and the dual timeline thing.
It's so yes,
fabulous.
Those are good. Those are so good. There are so many authors. Who else am I? Oh, I read and loved Honoré.
Fanon Jeffers.
Thank you.
Friend of mine.
Oh, wonderful book, 800 pages. Wonderful book.
I read it for 11 weeks. I read one section a week.
Okay.
Like on Sunday afternoons, like going to church. But it's well worth the time and the effort.
So
but it is
fabulous.
It is a big baby of a book.
I reviewed it for NPR, and I read it in a week. But it is an amazing. When I'm doing a review, that's the fastest. I also listen to it. I go between listening and reading as much as possible. That's phenomenal. Colson Whitehead's Harlem Shuffle is wonderful, very different flavor from his other books, and I really enjoyed that. I'm trying to think, because there's so many. Oh, Piper Hughley has a wonderful book coming out soon about Anne Lowe.
It's out.
Oh, it's out.
It
It's
came
right.
out on
Tuesday.
the 7th.
Oh.
Tuesday a week ago.
I've been working on that book.
Yes. It's called By Her
I
Own
lose
Design.
time. I've lost time.
And she's going to be here, right?
Yeah, I think
Yes.
she's. Oh,
Yes.
wonderful, wonderful. There's so many that. Historical fiction, I also read. I mentioned Eliza Knight, but I also love fantasy, and Leslie Penelope has some books coming out that are wonderful. And then I also read romances. Oh, one of my favorites is not a romance, but it's an amazing book. It's called The Seven Husbands
Of Evelyn Hugo.
Of Evelyn Hugo. If that book stays another minute on the New York Times bestseller list, I'm gonna scream. Not that it's a personal affront to me, I'm not on the list. But that book, the story behind it, which I think is fabulous, is that book is 2017 is when it came out. It's now on the New York Times bestseller list, and that has a lot to do with Daisy and the Six, which was her other book, but it did something called a celebrity book club. And the celebrity book club was the Reese book club, and that brought that author forward. Now, if you look at the New York Times bestseller list now, and this is my book critic head on right now, so excuse me for diving into this, but you'll see a woman named Colleen Hoover's name over and over again. Her book one of her books got discovered, and now people are just raiding her backlist, and she keeps going with forward with new books. So it's an interesting time for thrillers, historical fiction, not celebrity books club, but celebrities joining, or historical people, like you have the Clintons doing fiction. You have Dolly Parton doing with James Bond. I mean, there's some interesting things happening in the marketplace that, I enjoy paying attention to, in addition to so many books. A friend of mine, Tessa Bailey, just sold one of her books in a big TV deal that was announced. I think it's the one that made the New York Times bestseller list a couple of weeks ago. And it's a romance.
One summer?
Yes, it happened one summer.
I'm reading it right now.
Yeah, it just got a big deal. So anyway, here, I'm blah, blah, blah.
Yes, we could keep you here all night, but we won't. So thank you all for joining us. I have loved talking to you again, and hopefully next year, and the next, we'll find a way to chat together. But
Yes,
again,
yes.
thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a good night.